So we will talk with a Catholic intellectual, political commentator, writer, and editor, Professor E. Michael Jones. Topic we wanted to discuss was ethnicity, related to nationalism, related to let's say logos, Catholicity, and economics. So we'll try with that. So this ethnicity and nationalism was always a hot topic in Europe, but these days you have in the United States too some kind of a neo-Bismarck economic nationalism, and some attempts to set up a white identitarianism. Can you for the start comment on that new trends?
Up until World War II, the United States was basically a collection of ethnic colonies from Europe. This was most apparent in the north, in the big cities, where every big city had a little Germantown, Chinatown, Little Italy, on and on and on. Every ethnic group of any significant size had its own neighborhood. And the first to pioneer this were the Irish, who came in massive numbers during the middle of the 19th century and were heavily involved in the workers' movement. The ruling class at that time, after the Civil War, was basically a national ruling class that has come to be known as the WASP elite, the white Anglo-Saxon Protestants. They were contending with the Irish for this whole period of time, the latter part of the 19th century, and they eventually came to a modus vivendi. We will let you have control of your neighborhood as long as you don't threaten violent revolution and try to overthrow the United States government. That was a workable solution, it seems to me. You had the best of both worlds here. You had local government attuned to the needs of the people, who in this instance were all from specific areas from Europe. Okay? You had neighborhoods in Philadelphia, for example, where Catholics, they were both Catholic neighborhoods, where basically they could not talk to each other. The Irish could not talk to the Poles. They spoke a different language. And so what you had was a decentralized form of government that I think was in the spirit of the United States as founded by the Founding Fathers. In other words, the states had their own autonomy and they worked together to have some type of better union. Now, all of this was destroyed when the United States won World War II. The people who were the intelligence establishment during the war then got integrated into a program of what we now call social engineering. One group of these people became the CIA, and they dealt with foreign policy. The other group became involved in housing. And at this point, the government declared war on the ethnic neighborhood. The main way they did this, they used the carrot and the stick. Basically, the carrot was low interest rate mortgage loans for new houses being built in the suburbs. And the stick was black migration, basically bringing black sharecroppers up from the South. In a city like Chicago, this meant bringing black people up from Mississippi. These people were the proxy warriors of their day. They were the mujahideen of the American destruction of the American empire. And their job was to destroy Catholic ethnic neighborhoods, which is what they did. At this point, we lost whatever identity we had as an ethnic confederation, and we became part of one empire. Once the empire consolidated the local population, then they became more and more aggressive in projecting their power outward. So I think America did have a moment where it was successful in combining these two forces. In other words, ethnic particularity and collaboration on a wider scale. I think this is what you need, and I think this is what Yugoslavia was. Okay. It was a replacement for the Austro-Hungarian Empire that got created after World War I. uh, but it had certain advantages that, let's say, a state, I put this in quotes, known as Bosnia-Herzegovina, did not have. I once did a show for RT, and I got in trouble when I said, is Macedonia a state? I said, when did Macedonia become a state, and who created it? Well, some lady wrote in and said, this guy's an idiot. He doesn't even know that Macedonia is a state. Well, is it a state or not? And in this instance, I'd like to, at this point, refer to the experience I just had in Africa. I was in Tanzania. I wrote a book on Julius Nyerere about development economics. But in virtually every African country, what you have are an artificial lumping together of, in the case of Tanzania, 76 different ethnic groups. So on the one hand, you have this big, Nigeria is even worse. You have 330 different ethnic groups in a country that was artificially created in Berlin in 1888 as a country by the imperial powers who were ruling it at the time. So I think what you have here, in a sense, are the two extremes that we need to discuss, okay? On the one hand, an ethnic group in a country like Tanzania, which is too small to do anything on its own. On the other hand, an empire like the American empire at this point, which has created this artificial unification of the country by completely obliterating ethnic identity and using this as the basis for projecting imperial power onto the rest of the world.
Okay, but do you have some kind of a national identity? I mean, you are an American national, and you have young boys from America fighting for the flags and for the let's say for the interests of the country. Is it an American as a nationality? Is it already born and in place?
Well, that's the interesting thing here. So I could never understand America until I started to study Yugoslavia, because America is Yugoslavia. It was actually reading Franjo Tudjman's book of Nationalism, which opened my eyes to the reality of ethnic identity in America, which I'm claiming was very similar to ethnic identity in Yugoslavia. The sociological theory describing ethnic identity in America is known as the triple melting pot. America was known as the melting pot. During World War I, the Committee for Public Information, the propaganda ministry for the United States, put on what they called melting pot pageants all across the country, where basically they put up a big pot in the middle of a field, and they would have the various ethnic groups, American ethnic groups as of 1917, 1919, arrive in their costumes with their playing their musical instruments. They'd march up into the ethnic pot, and then they'd all march out wearing bowler hats and suits. This was the artificial propaganda version of the melting pot. The real version is called the triple melting pot. It's a sociological theory which basically says after 3 generations, American identity takes place in 3 ways. Basically, 3 ethnic groups: Protestant, Catholic, Jew. So you never become just an American, you become a Protestant American, a Catholic American, or a Jewish American. That's the triple melting pot, and it struck me as soon as I heard about it, I began to think, well, this is what Yugoslavia was. In a sense, Yugoslavia was a federation, okay, that was made up of 3 ethnic groups that were based on 3 religions. That's the real ethnic identity. That's the identity that perdures to this day. So, for example, I'm Irish and German. Okay, I'm not, in a sense, I am a European because I'm not any one culture. But my Irish grandfather came over in 1900, worked at the Baldwin Locomotive Factory in Philadelphia. He had 6 children, one of whom died young. Those 5 children all married. Only one married another Irishman, but all 5 of them married Catholics, because that was their understanding of ethnic identity. In other words, you're Catholic American, you're a Protestant American, or you're a Jewish American. That was the understanding of American identity. It's the only identity that makes sense over the long term in America.
Okay, well, if you're Yugoslavia, the future is not that bright for you. If the situation is the same.
Well, I think that what we saw here was that Yugoslavia was a solution to the problem we stated at the beginning. In other words, Bosnia-Herzegovina, correct me if I'm wrong, but as far as I know, Bosnia-Herzegovina was never a country. It's too small to be a country. And so what happened was that basically the United States, NATO, the imperialist powers felt that Yugoslavia was a threat to their hegemony over Europe, and they broke it up. And they broke it up using nationalism and created a series of small states that basically do not have the power that Yugoslavia did. I mean, all you have to do is think back. I mean, this occurred to me when I was doing the book on Julius Nyerere. Tito was a huge figure for the Third World during the 50s and 60s. He had a lot of power in the Third World. He was proposing an alternative to basically the bipolar world that the United States and the Soviet Union represented. All of that has been lost. No one from Bosnia-Herzegovina can have the standing on the international stage that Tito once had because it's just too small.
Well, that's right. I live here, so I have maybe a different view. Yeah, my view is that, especially America, did not want to partition Yugoslavia. The interest was in a way to push their view, their version of an economic reform on Yugoslavia. But they got here some bad allies and some bad assistance for that purpose, for that let's say enterprise, and it ended up into breakup. But it's a huge topic. So I really, what I wanted to talk and what is maybe here visible in Bosnia and Herzegovina, you here have like three religions: the Catholic, the Muslim, and the Orthodox. To be precise, Serb Orthodox, because you don't have basically Eastern Orthodoxy. It's like saying Western Christianity. You have this
right.
large number of ethnic churches. So what you had,
right.
what you had in Bosnia was basically three religions. Two of those were like universalists, the Muslims and the Croats and the Catholics, and the Serb Orthodox was, well, the Greek word would be philatist, but it was like ethnic or tribal.
Right. Right.
So and that was my aim, to talk about that, because from these two, basically two concepts, the universalists and the tribalist one, and as an extension, you have now even in your country like two visions of economic policies, of foreign policies. One would be America first, and another one you call globalism, if I understand correctly.
Right.
So
right.
That was more the aim of my interest. So which one of those concepts is more can be reconciled with Catholicism and with Logos ultimately?
First of all, America First was was a protest against globalism. America First, the original concept, the original organization was created during the 1930s to keep the United States out of another war in Europe. The leaders of America First came from the Midwest, which is where I live. I live in South Bend, Indiana. They were people like Henry Ford, who was the head of the Ford Motor Company, Charles Lindbergh, who flew that plane across the first man to cross the Atlantic in a single-engine airplane, and Father Charles Coughlin, who was a Canadian but who lived in Detroit and had the biggest radio show in the United States. Millions of letters every week, poured into his parish in Royal Oak, Michigan. Now, what these people had in common was, first of all, they did not want America to be involved in the European war. That was the main thing, because large numbers of these people in the Midwest, especially in places like Cincinnati, were Germans. They didn't want another war because they had had the first experience with World War I, which had a devastating effect on the United States culture. led to a corruption of morals throughout the 1920s, to debt, to all sorts of bad things. And these people felt they had learned the lesson. Okay. The other aspect of this was hearkening back to one of the early ideas of American economics, which was basically protected manufacturers. The whole story of Friedrich List and the creation of the Zollverein in Germany, which led to German unification in 1871, all had American correlatives. Friedrich List ended up going to the United States. He, in the early 19th century, he ended up in Reading, Pennsylvania, which is not far from where I grew up. He was the editor of the Redinger Adler, or the Reading Eagle, a German language newspaper. And during his spare time, he discovered a coal mine in a coal seam not far from where he was living. List's idea was in Germany to abolish all external tariffs and create internal tariffs, and abolish all internal tariffs, in other words, between individual states, and establish external tariffs that would prevent cheap English manufactured goods from coming into his country. That was the same thing he applied in the United States. That was what America First was about. This is how Donald Trump got elected, by channeling America First. I was in South Bend, Indiana, when Trump arrived. His advance man was basically trying out various things, how the crowd would react. As soon as the advance man said, Carrier Air Conditioning is sending its plant to Mexico, the crowd went wild, and that's what got Trump elected. Okay, so this was basically not against Wall Street. It was against New York. It was against the internationalists in the United States, and it was in favor of domestic economy, strengthening that economy. This is completely compatible with the teaching of the Catholic Church. I think that all of Europe, if you look at the beginning of Europe, the roots of Europe, if you look at the roots of the United States, they had something in common, which was basically what the Catholic Church would call subsidiarity. It wasn't just one empire, one state controlling everything from the top down, which is the way the communists like to run things. It was the preservation of local identity. In the beginning of the United States, at the beginning of the United States, those states, Virginia, New York, places like that, had their own governments, and they had veto power over what the federal government would do. This ended with the Civil War. That's in many ways what the Civil War was about, more so than slavery. And the federal government got to impose its own power over that government. What I'm saying is the Catholic solution, the successful solution, is the one that takes subsidiarity into account. In other words, the people on the local level should do everything that they can do within their power, and there should be no interference in this operation. At a certain point, when they reach the limits of their power, it's only then that they should defer to a federal government, which usually meant, defense against foreign invasion and things like that. That's the Catholic solution. America First was much more in line with this, because a lot of the people in America First were German Catholics who understood this completely. And it was much more in line with this than the American Empire and all that subsequent development. And I think the same thing is true of Yugoslavia.
Okay, yeah, you're right. What to say? But this, let's say this universalism, or we call it globalism, is then in a way a separate route, or let's say a competing ideology, or it's just a perverse copy of the Catholic system.
No, it's completely different. I mean, it goes back all the way to the beginning of Catholic theology. If you read St. Augustine's City of God, he's very clear in his approval of the Roman Republic, which he felt was moral and local, and his condemnation of the Roman Empire, which he felt was just a rule by thieves. It was just theft. given the aura of respectability by lending the government's name to it. He's very clear in distinguishing between republic and empire. And I think that distinction goes throughout Catholic theology all the way up to the present. The church invariably is forced to accommodate itself to a system that it may not agree with. I mean, the church had to do this in Poland under communism. It has to do it. It has to do it. It invariably has to do it. And it had to do it in the United States under the new regime. I'm saying the new regime that came into power after World War II, even though this regime was determined to destroy Catholic neighborhoods. Now, part of the problem here is Catholics didn't understand what was going on. They did not understand that there was a war being waged against them. And so in many ways, they collaborated with their enemies, with their oppressors. And the result was the church has been devastated in the United States. I would say the church has never recovered from the days of the ethnic parish. Never recovered. It had devastating effects on the ability to transmit the Catholic faith to successive generations in the United States. Most people, if you ask them, most conservatives in the United States, conservative Catholics, would blame it on Vatican II. I think it goes back to the war that the United States declared on ethnic parishes right after World War II. That is the beginning of the devastation of the church, Catholic Church in the United States.
So was that devastation needed to create an American nation, or it was it kind of collateral damage in trying to create a more homogeneous nation, or it was some kind of a plot or something?
It was a plot. I have a book called The Slaughter of Cities, in which it's called, the subtitle is Urban Renewal as Ethnic Cleansing. I have gone to the archives in cities like Chicago, Philadelphia, Detroit, and Boston. It was a plot on the part of the federal government. I'll name the people who were involved in it. There was a Jewish professor from the University of Chicago, sociologist by the name of Louis Wirth. He was involved with the OSS, which was the intelligence operation during World War II, which later became the CIA. All of the people involved in this were former intelligence operatives in the United States Intelligence Service during World War II. They all gravitated into either the CIA, which was the foreign projection of imperial power, or to local implementations of social engineering, which is what Louis Wirth was involved in Chicago. He said, and this is the letters he was writing. He was sent to Detroit. There was a race riot in Detroit in 1942. He was sent there to investigate it. He came to the conclusion that there are certain groups who cannot be trusted because of their origin. Well, what are you talking about here? He said, well, there's Germans and there's Italians. Okay, the United States was at war with Germany. They were at war with Italy. And then he says, and Irish and the Polish. Well, wait a minute. The United States is not at war with Ireland and Poland. So why did you lump those groups together? Well, the answer is, what do those four groups have in common? Germans, Italians, Irish, and Polish. Well, for the most part, they're all Catholics. And so this was the beginning of basically the war on the Catholic Church in the United States in order to destroy any base of resistance and create a unified block of people that could be used, drawn into the military or into the university system, and used to project imperial power onto the rest of the world.
Okay. So where does so you have ethnic neighborhoods, ethnic parishes. Where is the difference between ethnic neighborhoods, ethnic parishes, and ethnic identity, and the ethnic church like the Eastern Orthodox do have?
The problem with the Orthodox is that there's no overarching Orthodox church. As you mentioned, there's a Serbian Orthodox church, there's a Bulgarian Orthodox church, there's a Russian Orthodox church, there's a Greek Orthodox church. So so what you have here, what gave Europe its power was the fact that you had both at the same time. In other words, you had a clear identity as a German, but you also had an identity that was Catholic, that integrated you into an overarching structure that would allow for collaboration between these groups. Now, obviously, anyone who is familiar with European history knows that it wasn't all peace and light. There were constant. The best example would be the 30 Years' War in Germany. After the Reformation, these people, Germans, are fighting each other because they differed on theology. That's not accurate. It was economics that was basically the cause of the Reformation.
I agree.
But whatever, the Reformation, now that we're celebrating the 500th anniversary of the Reformation, let me state clearly, the Reformation was a looting operation. That's all it was. Certainly in England, there is no other explanation for the Reformation other than the fact that the aristocrats wanted church property and were willing to break the law and become criminals to steal it. That's all the Reformation was. Germany, there was a little bit of theological fairy dust sprinkled over it, but that's what it was in Germany as well. The princes wanted church property. In Bohemia, which is now the Czech Republic, 80% of the land was owned by the church. This was a temptation that the aristocrats could not resist, and that it broke out earlier there with the Hussite Rebellion. But that's in a sense what the Reformation was. But before that, we had 1,000 years of basically unification. That you had the possibility, at least the theoretical possibility, of being both English and being the member of the Universal Church. Once the Reformation happened, that was over. You had Protestant countries, you had Catholic countries, and with the Protestant country, you had the king having inordinate power over the church, and this is unfortunately what happened in the Orthodox world after the Great Schism. I was in St. Petersburg, and got to the place where the Tsar was assassinated in 1883, I believe, and they built a church right there. So St. Petersburg is Peter the Great's vision of a European Russia. Okay, it's nothing but Greek temples until you get to this church, and suddenly it's like the Disneyland version of the Russian Orthodox Church. It's the most elaborate Orthodox church you can imagine, completely the opposite of all the Greek temples surrounding it. And you go up there and you go around the church, and there are all these plaques. And what do the plaques commemorate? They commemorate Russia's battles. Where here's where we defeated the Kalmyks, and here's where we defeated the Kazakhs, and it's a completely national operation, And in this regard, it has a lot of similarities to Westminster Abbey in London, because England became a national church at a much later date. But what you have there is a celebration of England. Isaac Newton didn't believe in God. He didn't believe in the Trinity. Why is he buried in a church? He didn't believe anything. He had to lie to maintain his position at Cambridge University, because you had to believe in the Trinity to have a job there. He didn't believe in that, but the English put him there because they created this national church. This has been a disaster. These national churches have been a disaster for worldwide collaboration, and they've been a disaster for peace as well. Now, the good news is that Russia is no longer communist. That's good news, but they have gone back. They still have to deal with the problems of the national church, which is the norm among Orthodox churches.
Yes, well, the Greek word here is philitism, and the English translation would be tribalism, I guess. So
yes.
This reminded me. You were talking about Macedonia. There was, in fact, a Greek-Macedonian struggle when the Ottoman Empire started to collapse, and you have a Greek hero in northern Greece that's called Pavlos Melas, I think. So you have a really nice mosaic of Pavlos Melas with a rifle, and Archbishop next to him, like I don't know, it's some kind of a scene of benediction or something like that. and
Right.
the Meles guy with the rifle, well, he goes and shoots the other Eastern Orthodox, but that belong to another church. So it's not Greek church anymore. It's now Bulgarian or Macedonian, or not to get into all this trouble. But
Right.
all these national churches are in fact product of big empires. It was
Right.
the Eastern Roman Empire, and then the Ottoman Empire that fostered these things. I know here the Ottoman Empire, after the schism, the east-west border passed just through Bosnia and Herzegovina. This was the most western point where the Eastern Orthodoxy came, and by some strange coincidence, after the Ottomans, this was the Ottoman western border. After that, so the Ottomans conquered exactly the territory that was on the eastern part of the east-west schism. And what the Ottomans encouraged is severing ties with Rome. I mean, you could be a Christian in Ottoman Empire. You have just to renounce Rome. You had to sever your ties with Vatican, and you could do your business. You were a second-grade citizen,
Yeah.
but you were protected.
Right. Right.
Okay.
You find something similar in China. China, when they took over, they created the Chinese Patriotic Society, which means you could be a Catholic, but you could have no allegiance to Rome, because they understand that a totally local church is completely docile. It's more docile to the empire than some type of church that is linked with a universal church. Christianity is incompatible with just one nation. That is not to say that the nation cannot be Catholic. It just means that the Christian mission is universal. It cannot be limited to one nation. And so you can't use it as a justification for one nation fighting another. It just doesn't work that way. It has to, if you're talking about the overarching logos here of history and organization, the ethnic group has to fit itself into some type of overarching pattern, which is something that the ethnic group is not prone to do. I mean, if you go anywhere in the world and find some type of primitive ethnic group, let's say the Yanomami in the Amazon rainforest, they live completely isolated. They know that there are other people, but the word Yanomami means human being. And then as soon as anyone else is not a human being, well, we know that this is not true. You know, this is incompatible. This is a mistaken understanding of ethnicity. Obviously, there are all kinds of groups in the world. Language is the main force which shapes ethnicity. The family doesn't create a language. You don't get the language from the empire. You get it from an ethnic group. And then sometimes if an ethnic group becomes dominant, that becomes the language of the empire. But it starts off as the language of an ethnic group. This is something that cannot stand by itself. The ethnic group, as in most instances, just about every instance in Africa, let's say, is too small to have its own state. Maybe the Kikuyu in Kenya come close to having that ability, but everyone else is just too small. You can't have a state based on one ethnic group. Now, you could say, well, what about the Germans? Well, the Germans were exactly what I'm talking about. Up until 1871, there were all of these principalities that had tariffs against each other and were too small to be viable economically. And that's why Germany was crushed by France when Napoleon arrived. It was an incredibly traumatic experience for the Germans, because Napoleon just went through Germany, the German principalities, like a hot knife through butter. They provided, the only attempt was the Prussians. The Prussians tried to stop him. They couldn't stop him. The Austrians couldn't stop him. He was on his way to Russia. This had a traumatic effect on the Germans, and they realized we can't exist. We can't compete if we're all these small principalities. Even something big as Bavaria or Prussia simply could not compete. We have to unite. And Liszt was the man who proposed the vehicle for uniting. First, the railroads, which would unite them physically, and then the tariff, which would unite them economically. I think this is the tension that you have to accept in the world that we live in. In other words, you need ethnic identity because we have to speak to each other. You can't have people without an identity, but you need some type of modus vivendi that allows all these ethnic groups to collaborate with each other, and that can be the nation state on a political level and the Catholic Church on a theological level.
Okay, so in that regard, well, my question was, this all comes to the national unification and the nationalist economy principle, like the America First. When it comes to its peak, it kind of wants to overshadow like the Catholic Church and the Catholic structure. It becomes an obstacle. I guess it will. It's with all the big empires. It starts to create some frictions here.
Well, I mean, first of all, there was no friction between America First and the Catholic Church.
Oh, of course.
The Catholic Church supported America First. But if you're talking, let's talk about Germany in the 1930s.
Okay, I understand Liszt and I understand Bismarck. You in a way have a right to defend yourself, to defend your nation economically, and in that way to unite and to promote let's say your people first. But maybe it's easier to speak in military terms. I mean, like maybe, I don't know, Second World War, the American activities in the Pacific. That was American guys dying for the American flag, and let's say nuking of Hiroshima and Nagasaki was in a way America First. I mean.
No, I would disagree. America First.
Okay. No. I'm not talking about America First.
Kept America out of the war.
Yeah.
I mean, if you want to talk about it now, Trump got elected by channeling America First, and now he's doing the exact opposite. I don't see any coherence here with what the promises he made during the campaign. But if you go, so if you take the a step further, back to Germany, okay. Liszt, Bismarck, and then you've got Hitler.
Yeah.
Well, Hitler proposed an ideology of nationalism that was incompatible with the Catholic Church, and he knew it.
That's what I'm talking about. Yeah.
And I'm saying there is an ideology of nationalism that is out there right now that is incompatible with what we're talking about. Basically, it's the racial narrative, which is what Hitler made use of. He got it from the United States. He got it from Madison Grant. But basically, there was a whole, beginning in the 19th century, there was a whole counter narrative to what I'm calling the Logos narrative, which is the church's narrative. And this was the racial narrative.
How the powers stand now in the U.S.? Do you think that this racial identity narrative will continue to grow, or there will be some kind of reason to keep it under check?
A good way to answer that is to bring up what happened in Charlottesville in September. Okay, the elites in the United States have turned against the people. Now, there are certain people who view this economically. I'm one of them. I'm saying it's the oligarchs versus the people. There are certain people who view this racially, who say that, well, the government's against white people. The government discriminates against white people. And I think these are the people that gathered in Charlottesville to protest the city's attempt to take down the statue of Robert E. Lee. Now, what you saw here was a setup and a trap. The white guys were lured into a trap by the Jewish mayor of Charlottesville and the black deputy mayor. This is the Black Jewish Alliance. They lured them into this trap. They said they were going to give them police protection. Instead of giving them police protection, the police basically pushed the white guys into the communist Antifa demonstrators, where there was a fight. They wanted this fight because they want to discredit, they want to promote the racial narrative because it's easier to manipulate than the economic narrative. The oligarchs do not like the economic narrative, which is basically what got Trump elected. They like the racial narrative because it's doomed to failure. It's going to fail because it's incoherent. It doesn't make any sense. That's why they promote it.
Okay, we could go now back. It's a good time to go back to the Ottoman Empire, the tribal narrative and the economic narrative. In the Ottoman Empire, there was ban on usury, just like in medieval Europe. So only let's say only people that were allowed to do it were some kind of religious minorities, and one of them were the Armenians. So it was the Armenian Orthodox Church. So they basically had this I mean, they had this worldview that you cannot extort the usury from your brother, but again, they're Armenians, so the Ottomans are not their brothers. So that was this usurer class that was called Saraf in Turkic, and the richest man in Ottoman Turkey was in fact an Armenian, Migedic Darzilian. I don't know. I'm not sure how to pronounce it. So they were. It was a Christian church. It was let's say a manifestation of Logos, but again, here the priorities were mixed up. How they understood that usury is bad, just as bad among their own people. They could continue to extort it from the Ottomans. They have this kind of. Can you talk about this?
Yeah, well, you're talking about a situation that also existed in Europe at the time. There were people who took the prohibition against Leviticus, prohibition against usury in Leviticus, and said, well, it only applies to Jews lending to Jews. So therefore, if it's not part of your group, then you can lend to them. Well, the Jews certainly accepted this view of it, and the Jews became the brokers of usury in Europe. Beginning, I would say, let me get specific. When Cosimo de' Medici became the ruler of the Republic of Florence, he invited the Jews back to Florence because they had been expelled. They always get expelled whenever the usury burden gets too big. He invited them back because they were supposed to lend to the worker, because he had no intention of raising the wages of the workers in the textile industry in Florence. No intention of doing that. So they were going to be the lower end pawnbrokers in the economy, and he and his family were going to be the upper end, basically government bank that would lend to the popes and so on and so forth. So the Medici rule in Florence was the beginning of capitalism, and capitalism is state-sponsored usury, and this was the beginning of the real usury as a threat to the entire social order. Now, before that, for about a century, it was the beginning of the money economy in Europe, and at this point, peasants who basically used to work for a lord and paid their lord in days. They worked for him a certain number of days during the year. Now they had to pay him in money, and they didn't have any money because nobody had any money. It was not a money economy. And at this point, the Jews began to lend monies to people so they could pay taxes and doing like this. And this is how they got their foot in the door. And the Medicis only opened that door wider. Now, this is not compatible with Christian culture. It's not compatible with Catholicism, but it was tolerated by groups that became subversive of the social order. The Renaissance was an attempt to overthrow the Christian order in Italy. It was the return of paganism to Florence. And so what you had over this period of time is the spread of usury and the failure of the church to stop the spread. The biggest... Go ahead.
Could we define the usury problem and the usury mechanism, like in more economic words? How would you define usury and why it is anti-logos or un-Catholic?
Usury means interest on a loan. Pope Benedict XIV defined this in Vix Purvena. It is the teaching of the Catholic Church. Any interest on a loan is usury and sinful. Okay? Now, why is it sinful? Well, because usury is based on compound interest. The interest is collected compound, and compound interest is unnatural because over any period of time, it becomes unrepayable. There is no way to, it's a geometric progression, and a geometric progression is not natural. There's nothing in nature that can keep up with a geometrical progression. Okay, so eventually you get to the point where you cannot pay back the loan. It is impossible, economically impossible to pay back loans over a long period of time. The best example of this I can give is the Fugger family, which were also Catholics. They were the successors of the Medici as the bankers for the papacy. They were from Augsburg in Germany. They prided themselves, they lent to the Habsburgs. They prided themselves on never charging the Habsburgs more than 6%, which was really low compared to what interest rates were in Europe at that time. The Jew pawnbroker would charge a poor guy 43 1/3%, and he'd have to give his tools or his cloak as collateral for that loan. So the Medici began lending money to the Fugger. The Fugger family began lending money to the Habsburgs in 1494, which was basically 2 years after Columbus had discovered America. During that period of time, the Habsburgs owned every gold and silver mine in the New World. A river of gold and silver poured into the coffers of the Habsburgs, and in 1553, they went bankrupt. Now, how can you go bankrupt when you own every gold and silver mine in the New World? The answer is compound interest, because no force in the world can keep up with compound interest, and that's why it's immoral.
Okay, what about the interest that is not compound? I mean, I see...
That's a fee. That's called a fee, and a fee is legitimate.
Well,
a fee is a legitimate...
The fee is something that you apply just once. So... I see. I look at the usury problem because the interest is by definition profit, and if you want, there is even a logical explanation of that. If you want to obtain a profit, you have to have some kind of risk. I mean, what usury says, it says this one group of people has a right to have profits no matter what. That's the problem with usury. That's the problem with usury. So there is an ethnic component. I mean, this is our tribe, or our castes, like in India, and we just have a right to to other people's profits. But there is a way of let's say investing in accord with church teaching, and it was called societas. So you basically invest your money, but you take also the risks. If there is
absolutely
you can gain a profit, but you can also lose something. And
that's right.
The very nature of banking is the fact that you always collect some kind of a profit, and you don't take any risks. And
that's
after a long period of time, inevitably you will create some problems with that system.
Right. All of the church teaching is clear that there's no risk in a loan. Okay. Sometimes people find this hard to understand, but basically, if you miss a payment on your house mortgage, you lose the house, and the bank gets it back. Credit card, you pay 21%. Well, that's to take into account all the people who are not going to pay. They're going to default on their loans. So it's already programmed in that there's no risk on a loan. That's why it's immoral. If you want a profit, you have to share the risk. And if you do that, then you really can ask whatever you want. It's in the gospel. It's in the gospel where the man who buries his talent, he's condemned for not taking risk. And the man who does not bury his talent gets a return of 100-fold. That is the principle of sound investment. And usury is incompatible with sound investment because there's no risk in a loan.
Yeah, all right. And according to my view, the fact that obscured this thing, and that brought the church in a situation that it cannot respond to this new situations, is the takeover of the public finances by the oligarchs. I mean, that there was some kind of elite that were taking the money that is like a private good into his own hands and started debasing this money. So you have a problem where you have to pay the same amount you borrowed, but the same amount is not worth anything anymore. So you have basically a problem of amount of money versus value. So it's a problem that came on later, and the church didn't know how to resolve it. So it kind of tacitly approved interest in order to compensate for the loss of money. But the encyclical you mentioned, by chance, these words set up in the right way. It does not mention amount, so that you have to give back the amount that you borrowed. It talks about value, or the substance that you borrowed. I don't know if you understood me, if I'm clear enough.
Yes, I understand. Okay. So the problem here, modern banking began with the creation of the Bank in England in 1692. This was a private operation. It was the Whig oligarchs who got together and lent money to William of Orange so that he could wage war with France. Once you establish a private bank as the state bank, everyone you have taxpayers. This is William Cobbett. You have taxpayers and you have tax eaters, and the minority becomes tax eaters and the majority becomes taxpayers in something that can never succeed. You can never keep up with this because it's compound interest. And so the result of it was that the Whig oligarchs took over the government in England by creating the Bank of England, which had the aura of a public institution but was really privately owned. That's exactly the situation in the United States with the Federal Reserve System. It has the aura of a public institution, but it's in reality privately owned, and it gets run according to the interest of the oligarchs, not according to the interest of the people. If anyone needed proof of this, Paul Volcker's head of the Fed, became head of the Fed in 1978, and he wrecked the economy. He wrecked the American economy in the interests of the creditor class, because there was 10% inflation at that point, and the inflation was eating away at their wealth. And so he wrecked the manufacturing base of the United States in order to preserve the gains of the profits of the creditors. This has been the problem ever. It's been the problem throughout history. This is the problem right now. This is why Trump got elected, because the people of the United States realized that we had two parties representing the interest of the oligarchs and no party representing the interest of the people of the United States. Now, Trump has done everything within his power to wreck or betray the people who voted for him, but that is the fact of why he got elected. And that is the problem in Europe at this point right now. The difference between Germany and Greece is that Germany is the creditor and Greece is the debtor. And Greece can never get out of debt. It is impossible. They cannot get out of debt. And so every loan that they get basically goes right through the country and back into the hands of the creditors to pay off a previous loan. It's an impossible situation. It will destroy the European Union.
Well, it's not impossible. All Greece needed to do is default. That will save the situation.
That's right.
This constant reprogramming of debt, or turning over of debt, is destroying the system.
Right, you're right. That's the difference between Ireland and Iceland. Yeah. Both of these countries had large debt. The people of Iceland said basically the banks ran up the debt. We are not responsible for those banks. They were private banks. If you want your money back, there's the guy who owns the bank. Get it from him. We're not paying you off. We're not paying off that debt. And at that point, the entire world financial establishment threatened them, and nothing happened. Unfortunately, Ireland did the exact opposite. The government took responsibility for bad debt, and as a result, they've been saddled with economic problems ever since.
You're right. There even Iceland is even more interesting. I didn't prepare for this, but I read that in Iceland, there was a prime minister that gave a task to one of his economists to create, let's say, a moral and a stable economic system. And I read there is a PDF page somewhere on the net. I can even find the name of the guy. The system was like it was taken from a Catholic handbook. I mean, it was an ideal thing. Of course, it did not get implemented, but it was all there. Like usury-free lending. It was the monetary system that is really put to use like a common good, like a good of the people. But it, of course, it was never implemented. It is probably in some drawer somewhere. So Iceland is very, very interesting in in terms of economic policy.
Right.
So what's the end game in the United States? How you see the economy there going on, and the political situation and the economic consequences of this
Well, first of all, the economy is saddled with bad debt because the United States government stepped in and preserved all of the assets of Goldman Sachs. They had all of this trillions of dollars of bad debt in derivatives. Basically, they were given full face value for the debt by quantitative easing. And so now the result is there's no demand in the economy because everyone's paying off usurious loans. So, for example, the people who bought the houses at the height of the housing bubble, which led to the subprime mortgage crisis, are still paying off a loan on a value that doesn't exist. Assuming that they bought a house for $300,000, it's probably worth $50,000 now, but they have to pay off the full face value of the debt. Well, this is not just. It's known as being underwater. What should have happened is that Goldman Sachs, they should have taken them in, they should have lined them up against the wall and got their guns out and said, you're going to take a haircut. That's the term for basically, you're not going to get full face value. This is bankruptcy. You're in bankruptcy, you're going to get 5%. And if you don't like it, we'll get the firing squad and we'll shoot you. That's what they should have done. They didn't do it because Obama was a stooge of the oligarchs. Okay, he did whatever the oligarchs wanted, and they wanted full face value, and that's what they got. And so the economy now is crippled with bad debt.
In terms of foreign policy, was also he a stooge of the oligarchs because he had
Absolutely. If there were ever a stooge of the oligarchs, it was Obama. He killed more people after he won the Nobel Peace Prize. He killed more people by drones than any other president in the United States, and continued the war in Syria, which has now been lost. He did everything the oligarchs wanted. There's not one thing. The only thing I can think of would be the Iran nuclear deal, and that was a dispute between two camps of Jews. The Likudniks didn't want it, but the J Street Jews did want it.
Okay.
That's the situation now.
Okay, Mr. E. Mike Jones, do you have something to add?
I think that's pretty much it. I think we covered the whole territory. Okay. Pleasure to talk to you, Tony.
Pleasure to talk to you, Mike. We'll translate this and we'll see if it will be aired on the intended outlet. If not, we'll find some alternative one. Okay, thank you.
Great. Keep in touch. Thank you.
Bye. Thank you.
Bye-bye.